Sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it feels like the end of the world. Grace Whitmore thought her journey west would bring freedom, but a deadly blizzard leaves her stagecoach buried in snow with her driver frozen dead. When a mountain man named Jonah Harris finds her, she discovers he hasn't touched another human being in 23 years. His wife died in his arms during a harsh winter, and he's been living alone in his cabin ever since. Grace is a wealthy woman from back east who's never had to fight for survival. Jonah is a man who's forgotten what it means to care for someone. But as they're snowed in together, something begins to grow between them. Grace becomes the first woman Jonah has allowed himself to feel anything for since his wife's death. What happens when dangerous men come looking for Grace, and Jonah must choose between his solitude and protecting the woman who's awakened his heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Whitmore's eyes opened to unfamiliar shadows dancing across rough-hewn log walls. The acrid scent of wood smoke mingled with something earthy and wild, bear grease perhaps, or the lingering musk of animal hides. Her body ached as though she'd been trampled by horses, and when she tried to sit up, every muscle protested with sharp reminders of her ordeal. "Easy now." The voice came from somewhere beyond her vision, deep and rusty from disuse. "You've been unconscious for near 2 days." She turned her head toward the sound and found herself staring at a man unlike any she'd ever encountered in Boston's refined parlors. Jonah Harris stood beside a stone fireplace, his massive frame casting long shadows in the flickering light. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark waves, streaked with early silver, and a full beard covered the lower half of his weathered face. But it was his eyes that caught her, pale blue like winter sky, holding depths of sorrow that made her chest tighten with unexpected empathy. "Where?" Her voice cracked. Her throat felt raw, as if she'd been screaming. "My cabin. Found you half buried in snow drift about 3 miles down the mountain." He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, lifting a wooden bowl from beside the fire. "Driver didn't make it. I'm sorry." The memory rushed back the horses, screaming as they lost footing on the icy trail, the sickening lurch as the stagecoach tumbled down the embankment, Thomas crying out her name before the crushing weight of wood and metal silenced him forever. Grace pressed her palm against her mouth, fighting the bile that rose in her throat. "Drink this." Jonah approached cautiously, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. "It's just broth, but you need something warm inside you." She accepted the bowl with trembling hands, noting how he was careful not to let their fingers touch. The broth tasted of venison and wild herbs, nothing like the delicate consommes served at her father's table, but it warmed her from within and steadied her shaking. "How long have I? Where exactly are we?" "Colorado Territory, high country. We're snowed in until spring thaw, which won't come for months yet." He settled into a chair across the room, maintaining careful distance between them. "Name's Jonah Harris. I've been living up here since, well, for a long time." Grace studied her surroundings more carefully now. The cabin was surprisingly well built, with tight-fitted logs and a stone chimney that drew the smoke cleanly. Hand-hewn furniture filled the single room, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with preserved foods and leather-bound books. Everything spoke of careful craftsmanship and solitary purpose. A rope bed occupied one corner, covered with thick furs and woolen blankets. She realized she was lying in his bed, and he must have been sleeping elsewhere. "I'm Grace Whitmore," she said, then hesitated. Her father's name carried weight even in the territories. Cornelius Whitmore owned half the railroad lines west of the Mississippi. But something about Jonah's isolation suggested he might not know or care about such things. "Whitmore." He nodded slowly. "Like the railroad man. So much for anonymity. He's my father." "What's a railroad heiress doing in a stagecoach heading toward nowhere?" The question hit closer to home than she'd expected. Grace set down the bowl and pulled the fur blankets closer around her shoulders. She still wore her traveling dress, though someone, Jonah, she realized with a flush of embarrassment, had removed her outer coat and boots. The green silk was torn and stained, ruined beyond repair. I was traveling to California. I have an aunt in San Francisco who... She stopped, unwilling to voice the lie she'd prepared for curious strangers. Something about Jonah's steady gaze made deception feel impossible. "Running away," he said simply. "It wasn't a question. My father arranged a marriage. To a business associate." The words came out bitter. "Raymond Blackwell. He owns shipping interests, and father wants to merge our railroad holdings with his transport companies. And you don't want to marry him." Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Raymond Blackwell is a cruel man who sees women as property to be acquired. I've heard the servants' whispers about what happened to his first wife. She died in a fall down the stairs, though she never seemed clumsy before." Jonah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So you ran." "I left in the middle of the night with nothing but what I could carry." She touched her throat, feeling for the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. It was still there, the smooth spheres warm against her skin. "I thought if I could reach California, I could disappear, start over somewhere he'd never think to look. And now you're trapped on a mountain with a stranger." Jonah rose and moved to the window, peering through the thick glass at the swirling snow beyond. "Storm's been raging for 3 days. Even if the pass was clear, it's a hard 2-day ride to the nearest town. On foot, in winter." He shook his head. Grace absorbed this information, fighting down panic. "How long until spring?" 4 months, maybe 5. Depends on when the snow breaks. 4 months. She had provisions for 2 weeks at most, and those were buried with the stagecoach. "I have money," she said quickly. "In San Francisco, I have accounts my father doesn't know about. I can pay you for food, shelter." "Don't need money." Jonah's voice was flat. "Wouldn't do me any good up here anyway." "Then what do you need?" She heard the desperation creeping into her voice and tried to control it. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally turned from the window, something in his expression made her breath catch. Pain lived in those blue eyes, old and deep as canyon walls. "I need you to understand something, Miss Whitmore. I've been alone on this mountain for 23 years. Haven't spoken to another human being in more than 8 months. I'm not," he struggled with the words, "I'm not good at this anymore. Having someone here, it's difficult," she finished softly. He nodded. "I'll see you through to spring. Won't let you starve or freeze. But I can't promise to be easy company." Grace studied his face, seeing past the wild hair and untrimmed beard to the man beneath. There was strength there, and integrity, but also a loneliness so profound it made her own troubles seem small by comparison. "May I ask why?" she ventured. "Why you've been alone so long?" Jonah's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers finding something beneath his rough wool shirt. "I had a wife, Sarah. She died 23 years ago come February." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry. She was with child, both of them." His voice broke, and he turned away again. "I couldn't save them, couldn't do anything but watch them slip away. And you've been here ever since. Built this cabin for her, for our family." He gestured at the careful craftsmanship surrounding them. "After she died, I just stayed. Seemed like the right thing to do." Grace understood now why his movements were so careful around her, why he maintained such deliberate distance. She represented something he'd lost, a reminder of dreams that had died with his wife. "I won't be a burden," she said quietly. "I'll earn my keep however I can." Jonah looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. She was still pale from her ordeal, her dark hair escaping its pins to frame her face in disheveled waves. But there was determination in her green eyes, a strength that hadn't been broken by her father's attempts to control her life or by the trauma of the accident. "Can you cook?" he asked. Not well, but I can learn. So, yes, I do embroidery, but I suppose I could manage practical mending. Good. Clothes don't last long up here, and I'm not handy with a needle. He moved to a chest in the corner, pulling out an armload of garments. These were Sarah's. She was taller than you, but you can alter them. That silk dress won't last a week in this climate. Grace accepted the bundle of wool and cotton garments, struck by the intimacy of wearing a dead woman's clothes. But practicality won over sentiment. Jonah was right about the silk. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know this isn't what you wanted." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she understood his sacrifice. He admitted, "It's not what I wanted, but maybe what we want isn't always what we need." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls. Grace pulled Sarah's clothes closer, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the fabric. 4 months stretched ahead of them, 4 months of forced intimacy with a man who'd forgotten how to be around other people, 4 months of winter isolation that would either forge an unlikely bond or drive them both to madness. As if reading her thoughts, Jonah moved to the fireplace and added another log to the flames. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said, his back to her. "See what comes." Grace nodded, though he couldn't see her. One day at a time. In Boston, she'd planned months in advance, her life mapped out in social engagements and charitable committees. Now she faced an uncertain future with nothing but her own resilience and the reluctant protection of a mountain hermit who wore his grief like armor. But as she watched Jonah tend the fire with gentle, practiced movements, she found herself thinking that perhaps uncertainty wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. Perhaps sometimes you had to lose your way completely before you could find where you truly belonged. 3 days later, Grace discovered the journal. She'd been exploring the cabin while Jonah checked his snares, moving carefully among his possessions with the respect born of being an uninvited guest. Most of the books on his shelves were practical guides to wilderness survival, weather patterns, animal tracking, but tucked between a volume on preserving meat and another on identifying edible plants, she found something different. The leather binding was soft with age, its pages filled with delicate handwriting in faded brown ink. Pressed flowers decorated the margins, mountain laurel, wild columbine, herbs she couldn't name. Each entry was dated, spanning several years in the 1840s, and as Grace read, she realized she was holding Sarah Harris's medical journal. June 15th, 1847. Mrs. Garrett's rheumatism much improved with the willow bark tea. Must remember to gather more before the season ends. Jonah says, "I fuss too much over the neighbors, but someone must tend to them in this wilderness." August 3rd, 1847. Delivered the Morrison baby safely, a strong boy with his father's lungs. Jonah carved a cradle while I was tending the mother. He'll make such a wonderful father when our time comes. Grace's heart clenched at the hope in those words, knowing how the story ended. She turned the page and found more entries about births, illnesses treated, remedies that worked, and others that failed. Sarah had been the closest thing to a doctor in these mountains, traveling dangerous trails to help anyone who needed her. October 12th, 1847. I'm certain now our child grows within me. Jonah doesn't know yet. I want to be sure before I tell him, but oh, how my heart soars with the secret. He's been so patient, so gentle. This baby will be surrounded by such love. What are you doing? Grace spun around, clutching the journal to her chest. Jonah stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his coat and boots. His face had gone deathly pale, and she realized she'd crossed an invisible line. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. I was just—" "Put it back!" His voice was barely controlled. "Jonah, please. I wasn't trying to invade your privacy." The book fell open, and I saw— "Put it back now." He moved toward her, and for the first time since her rescue, Grace felt afraid. not of physical harm, but of the raw pain blazing in his eyes. She set the journal carefully on the shelf, but couldn't bring herself to look away from his face. She was a healer. She was everything. The words came out broken. And she's gone. She loved you very much. It's clear in every word she wrote. Jonah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think I need reminding? You think I don't know what I lost? I think you've been carrying guilt that isn't yours to bear. The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Grace knew she was overstepping, but something in Sarah's words compelled her to continue. She writes about helping other women deliver babies safely. She knew the risks. She chose to have a child anyway because she loved you that much. And I killed them both. Jonah's voice cracked. I couldn't save them, couldn't do anything but watch them die. You didn't kill them. Sometimes terrible things happen, and there's no one to blame. Easy words from someone who's never held their dying wife in their arms. Grace flinched, but pressed on. You're right. I've never experienced that kind of loss. But I've watched my father destroy himself with guilt over my mother's death. She died of consumption when I was 12, and he convinced himself that if he'd found better doctors, spent more money, moved her to a different climate. It's not the same thing, isn't it? Grace moved closer, close enough to see the unshed tears in his eyes. You've been punishing yourself for 23 years for something that was never your fault. Sarah wouldn't want that for you. Don't. He backed away from her. Don't tell me what she'd want. She'd want you to live, not just survive. The words hit their mark. Jonah staggered, as if she'd struck him, his face cycling through pain, anger, and something that might have been hope before settling back into familiar granite. You don't know anything about it, he said quietly. You're a spoiled rich girl, running from an unpleasant marriage. You have no idea what real loss feels like. The insult stung because it held a grain of truth. Grace's problems were nothing compared to his tragedy. But she'd also seen something in that journal, in the careful way he'd preserved every page, that told her he wasn't as resolved to his isolation as he pretended. Maybe you're right, she said. Maybe I am just a spoiled rich girl. But I'm also the first person you've talked to in months, and the first woman to set foot in this cabin since Sarah died. That has to mean something. That has to mean something. Before he could respond, she moved past him toward the door. I need some air. Don't go far. There are wolves. I won't go far. Grace stepped into the bitter afternoon, wrapping one of Sarah's wool cloaks around her shoulders. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind cut through the fabric like knives. She walked to the edge of the clearing, where Jonah had built his cabin, looking out over the endless expanse of white-capped peaks. Behind her, she heard the cabin door close with deliberate softness. He wasn't angry anymore, she realized. He was scared. Scared of feeling something other than grief, scared of betraying Sarah's memory, scared of opening his heart only to lose everything again. Grace understood that fear better than he knew. Her whole life had been about avoiding emotional risk, accepting her father's plans, staying within the narrow confines of respectable society, never reaching for anything that might be taken away. The arranged marriage to Raymond Blackwell was just the final link in a chain of safe, controlled choices. But safety was an illusion. The stagecoach accident had taught her that. One moment of ice on the trail, and everything changed forever. When she returned to the cabin 20 minutes later, Jonah was sitting at the table with Sarah's journal open before him. His finger traced the pressed flowers on one page, and his shoulders shook with barely suppressed emotion. She pressed these the summer before she died, he said without looking up. Said she wanted to remember what beauty looked like when winter came. Grace hung the cloak on its peg and approached slowly. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was. Delivered half the babies in these mountains, tended the sick, never turned anyone away, even saved a Ute warrior once when his own medicine man couldn't help him. He gave her that necklace there as payment. He nodded toward a simple beaded choker hanging on a wooden peg. You loved her very much, more than my own life. He closed the journal carefully. When she died, part of me died too. The part that believed in tomorrow, in hope, in any kind of future worth having. But you're still here. I'm still breathing. That's not the same thing. Grace pulled out the other chair and sat across from him. What would it take to make you want to live again? The question seemed to surprise him. I don't know. I stopped thinking about it a long time ago. Maybe that's the problem. They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded through the windows. Finally, Jonah spoke again. Tell me about this man you're running from. This Blackwell. Grace's hand went instinctively to her throat, fingering her mother's pearls. Raymond Blackwell owns the largest shipping company on the East Coast. He's 43 years old, twice widowed, and has a reputation for getting what he wants, regardless of the cost. My father sees him as the perfect business partner. I see him as a man who would control every breath I take. He'll come looking for you. The certainty in Jonah's voice sent ice through her veins. What makes you say that? Men like that don't give up their property easily. And make no mistake, that's what you are to him. Property. Jonah's jaw tightened. Question is, how hard will he look, and how far will he go? My father will have people searching, private investigators, maybe Pinkerton agents, but they'll be looking for someone traveling west by train or stagecoach, not someone stranded on a mountain. For now, come spring, when the pass is open, they'll expand their search. Mountain towns, trading posts, anywhere a woman might have taken shelter. Grace felt the walls of the cabin suddenly feel very small. You think he'll find me? I think he'll try, and I think you need to be ready for that. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. Ready how? You came up here as a helpless city woman who'd never faced real hardship. If you want to survive what's coming, you need to become someone else, someone stronger. And you'll help me? Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still resting on Sarah's journal. When he looked up, Grace saw a spark of something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not quite hope, but not despair either. I'll teach you what I can, he said finally. How to shoot, how to track, how to live off the land if you have to. But the rest, the strength, the courage that has to come from inside you. What if it's not there? It's there, I've seen it. He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a rifle and setting it on the table between them. Question is whether you're willing to find it. Grace stared at the weapon, its wooden stock worn smooth by decades of use. 3 days ago, she'd been a railroad heiress whose biggest worry was avoiding her father's social obligations. Now she was discussing firearms training with a mountain hermit who might be her only hope of staying alive. When do we start? She asked. For the first time since she'd known him, Jonah Harris almost smiled. The first week of Grace's training nearly broke her. Jonah woke her before dawn each morning, when the cabin lay in darkness and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. While she stumbled through the motions of washing her face with ice-cold water, he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge and dried venison. They ate in companionable silence. Then began the day's lessons. First rule of survival, he said on her 4th morning of training, handing her the rifle she was learning to handle. Everything is trying to kill you. The cold, the animals, the terrain, other people. You respect that, or you die. Grace hefted the weapon, feeling its weight distribute across her palms. The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, and her arms ached from yesterday's practice session. But she was learning to sight down the barrel without flinching when Jonah corrected her stance. My father always said that knowledge was power, she replied, adjusting her grip according to his previous instructions. I suppose that applies here too. Your father never had to shoot a charging bear. Jonah moved behind her, his hands briefly covering hers to adjust her positioning. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she tried to focus on his instruction rather than the warmth of his calloused palms. Knowledge is good, instinct is better, and practice is everything. They spent the morning on marksmanship, using tin cans set on fence posts 50 yards from the cabin. Grace's first shots went wide, the rifle's kick jarring her shoulder despite Jonah's warnings. But gradually, she found her rhythm. By noon, she was hitting 3 targets out of 5 attempts. Better, Jonah admitted, gathering the spent cans. But a tin can doesn't move like a man does, doesn't shoot back either. Do you really think it will come to that? Jonah's expression grew serious. I hope not. But hope doesn't keep you alive when trouble comes calling. After lunch, he taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of rabbits, the larger pads of mountain cats, the distinctive claw marks that meant bear. Grace found herself fascinated by this wilderness alphabet, the way Jonah could look at disturbed snow and tell her a story about the creature that had passed. Deer came through here yesterday evening, he said, crouching beside a set of hoofprints. Young buck, probably 2 years old. See how deep the prints are in the front? He was moving fast, running from something. What was chasing him? Jonah pointed to larger prints nearby, round pads with 4 distinct toe marks. Mountain lion. Big one, probably male. But see here. He indicated where the tracks diverged. The deer made it to that rocky outcrop. Cat gave up the chase. Smart deer, or lucky deer. In the wilderness, there's not much difference between smart and lucky. Both keep you breathing. Grace studied the tracks, trying to see the story Jonah read so easily. How do you know all this? Did someone teach you? My father, some. But mostly I learned by watching, by making mistakes. His expression darkened. By burying the consequences of those mistakes. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone warned her off. Instead, she focused on memorizing the different track patterns, the way a walking animal's prints differed from a running one, how weather could obscure or preserve the signs. Afternoons were for practical skills. Jonah taught her to maintain the fire, to bank coals so they'd last through the night, to select the right wood for different purposes. Hardwood for long-burning heat, softwood for quick flames, the way to stack logs so air could feed the fire properly. Fire is life up here, he explained, demonstrating how to use flint and steel when matches weren't available. Lose your fire in winter, and you'll freeze to death in hours. Grace's fingers were clumsy at first, but she persisted until she could strike sparks consistently. The repetitive motion became meditative, and she found herself thinking about the dramatic changes in her life. 3 weeks ago, she'd never held a rifle or started a fire from scratch. Now these skills felt essential, like breathing. Evenings brought different lessons. Jonah showed her how to mend clothes with sturdy field stitches, how to waterproof leather with animal fat, how to preserve meat by smoking and salting. His hands moved with unconscious grace as he demonstrated each technique, and Grace found herself watching him with growing appreciation. You made all the furniture, she observed one night as he carved wooden pegs to repair a broken chair. The table, the beds, the shelves. Had plenty of time. His knife moved in smooth, controlled strokes, shaving paper-thin curls from the hardwood. Winter nights are long when you're alone. Grace examined the chair more closely, noting the careful joinery, the way each piece fit perfectly with the others. The craftsmanship spoke of patience and skill, but also of love. This furniture had been built for a home, not just shelter. You were making a life here, with Sarah. Jonah's hands stilled on the carving. We plan to have children, fill this cabin with family. He resumed his work, but his movements had grown mechanical. Foolish dreams, not foolish. Beautiful. Beautiful dreams that turned into nightmares. Grace set down the sock she was darning and moved to the window. Outside, snow continued to fall in the steady, relentless way of mountain winter. The world beyond the glass looked cold and hostile, but inside the cabin, warmth and light created a pocket of safety. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked. Going back to civilization? What would I do there? I'm not the same man who came up here 23 years ago. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Jonah looked up from his carving, studying her face in the firelight. You're different too than when you first arrived. Grace considered this. Her hands had grown calloused from rifle practice and wood chopping. Her fair skin had taken on the ruddy glow of someone who spent time outdoors. Most importantly, she felt different inside, stronger, more self-reliant. I like the person I'm becoming up here, she admitted. I never realized how small my life was before, how much of it was about avoiding difficulty rather than embracing challenge. This mountain changes people, strips away everything that doesn't matter, leaves only what's essential. What's essential about you? The question seemed to surprise him. He set down his knife and studied his hands, scarred, capable hands that could build furniture or field dress. A deer with equal skill. I don't know anymore, he said finally. Used to think I knew exactly who I was. Husband, future father, provider. When Sarah died, all that disappeared. But you're still a protector. You saved my life. That was circumstance. Was it? You could have left me in the snow, could have taken me to the nearest town as soon as the weather cleared. Instead, you brought me here, shared your home, started teaching me to survive. That's not circumstance, that's choice. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Maybe, he said finally, or maybe I'm just tired of being alone. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. I'm glad you saved me, she said softly. Not just because I would have died, but because I think we both needed this. This chance to become something different. And what are you becoming, Grace Whitmore? She smiled, thinking of the morning's target practice, the calluses forming on her palms, the way she now moved through the cabin with confident familiarity. Someone who doesn't run away anymore, she said. Someone who stands and fights. By the end of her second week, Grace had transformed her appearance as dramatically as her skills. The elaborate bustle and multiple petticoats of her ruined traveling dress had given way to Sarah's practical wool skirts and sturdy cotton blouses. She'd altered them to fit her smaller frame, cutting away yards of excess fabric and hemming everything to a sensible length that wouldn't catch on cabin furniture or outdoor obstacles. The torn silk dress now served as cleaning rags, its once precious fabric reduced to utilitarian scraps. Grace felt no sadness at its destruction. The garment belonged to a different woman, one who existed in drawing rooms and attended charity luncheons. This new version of herself needed clothes that could withstand rifle practice and wood chopping. You look like you belong here now, Jonah observed one morning as Grace emerged from behind the privacy screen, wearing a deep blue wool dress she'd finished altering the night before. She glanced down at herself, noting how the practical garments changed not just her appearance but her posture. Without restrictive corsetry and layers of silk, she moved more freely, more confidently. I feel like I belong here, she admitted, then paused, surprised by her own words. Is that strange? 3 weeks ago, I would have called this place primitive. Now I can't imagine wanting to live anywhere else. Jonah was preparing their morning meal, his movements efficient and practiced. Mountain life suits some people better than others. Sarah took to it right away, said she felt more herself here than she ever had in town. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without visible pain, Grace realized. The sharp edges of his grief were beginning to soften, worn smooth by their daily conversations and shared routines. Tell me about her, Grace said, settling at the table. What was she like? Jonah handed her a bowl of porridge, then took his own seat across from her. Strong. Stronger than me in most ways. She could deliver a baby in the middle of a blizzard, then come home and bake bread like nothing had happened. He smiled slightly at the memory. Stubborn, too. Once she set her mind on something, there was no changing it. She sounds wonderful. She was. But she was also practical. Sarah understood that life up here was hard, that people died for small mistakes. She never would have wanted me to. He stopped, seeming to catch himself before finishing the thought. To what? To stop living because she couldn't. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Grace reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that felt natural despite their short acquaintance. Maybe it's time you started listening to her again. Before Jonah could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was subtle, the soft crunch of snow under careful footsteps, the kind of sound an animal might make, or a person trying not to be heard. Jonah was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace. Grace had learned to associate with his wilderness instincts. He peered through the glass, his body tense with alertness. "What is it?" Grace whispered. "Maybe nothing, but something spooked the horses." He moved to the rifle rack beside the door, selecting a weapon and checking its load. Could be a predator, or... The footsteps came again, closer this time. Definitely human, Grace realized with a spike of fear. Someone was circling the cabin, trying to remain undetected. "Stay back from the windows," Jonah murmured, motioning her toward the far corner of the room. "If shooting starts, get behind the bed and stay down." Grace's newly acquired rifle skills deserted her as panic flooded her system. "Do you think it's—" "Don't know yet. Could be a trapper. Could be someone lost in the storm. Could be someone looking for you." The thought that Raymond Blackwell's men might have found her sent ice through Grace's veins. She'd begun to feel safe in the cabin's isolation, protected by winter and distance from her former life. The possibility that her pursuers had tracked her here made the walls suddenly feel paper-thin. Jonah positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready but not yet aimed. "If it's trouble, follow my lead. Don't hesitate, don't second-guess. Hesitation gets you killed." A knock echoed through the cabin, 3 slow, deliberate raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and ominous. "Jonah Harris?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight accent Grace couldn't place. "I'm looking for Jonah Harris." Jonah's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer immediately. Grace could see him thinking, weighing options and risks. "Who's asking?" he called finally. "Name's McCready, Tom McCready. I'm tracking someone, and I heard you might have seen something." Grace felt her heart stop. A tracker, probably hired by her father or Blackwell to find her. She met Jonah's eyes across the room and saw her fear reflected in his expression. "Don't know any McCready," Jonah replied, "and I haven't seen anyone up here in months." "That's strange, because I found stagecoach wreckage down the mountain, driver's body too, but no passengers." The voice moved along the cabin's front wall as McCready continued circling. Tracks led this direction before the snow covered them. Grace pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was it, the confrontation she'd dreaded. She thought of Raymond Blackwell's cold eyes, his reputation for violence, and knew that being found meant more than just returning to an unwanted marriage. It meant disappearing entirely. "Lots of animals pass through here," Jonah said. "Could have been anything making those tracks." "Could have been, but I'm thinking it was a woman, wealthy woman from back east, probably scared and running from something. Her family's real worried about her." "Sorry, I can't help you." There was a pause. Then McCready's voice took on a different tone, harder, more threatening. "See, here's the thing, Harris. I know someone's in there with you. I can smell 2 kinds of soap, and I count 2 coffee cups on your table through that window. So why don't you save us both some trouble and just open the door?" Grace saw Jonah's grip tighten on his rifle. She realized with growing terror that this wasn't going to end with conversation. "Last chance, Harris. Open up. Or I'll open it for you. Like hell you will." Jonah's voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced death before and wasn't impressed by threats. The first shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass cascading across the floor. Grace screamed and dropped behind the bed as Jonah had instructed, her heart hammering against her ribs. That was a warning, Macready called. Next one goes through your head. Jonah moved with deadly purpose, positioning himself where he could see the broken window while staying clear of the line of fire. "Grace," he said quietly, "there's a rifle behind you in the corner. Can you reach it?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the weapon. "Good. If he gets past me, you shoot him. Don't think about it, don't hesitate, just pull the trigger." The second shot punched through the cabin's wooden wall, embedding itself in the opposite wall inches from where Grace crouched. She bit back another scream, forcing herself to focus on Jonah's calm instructions rather than her terror. "I've got men surrounding this place," Macready shouted. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send out the woman, and nobody else has to die." "He's lying," Jonah said quietly. "If he had backup, they'd have already made their move." But as if summoned by his words, another voice called from the cabin's rear. "Boss, I'm in position." Grace's blood turned to ice. There were at least two of them, possibly more. Even with Jonah's skills, the odds were turning against them. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jonah's expression had gone cold, calculating. In that moment, Grace glimpsed the man he'd been before. Grief and isolation changed him a warrior, not a hermit. "We fight," he said simply, "and we win." The attack came at dawn, swift and brutal. Jonah's rifle spoke first, its sharp crack echoing through the mountain stillness. Through the shattered window, Grace saw a man in a dark coat stumble backward into the snow, clutching his shoulder. Not Macready, someone else. Someone younger who'd gotten careless in his approach to the cabin. "That's for the window," Jonah muttered, already reloading with practiced efficiency. Macready's response was immediate and vicious. A hail of bullets peppered the cabin's front wall, forcing Jonah to drop below the windowsill. Splinters of wood flew through the air, and Grace pressed herself flatter against the floor behind the overturned table they'd dragged into position as a barricade. Sarah's guardian lay across Jonah's knees, the rifle he'd named for his dead wife, the one he'd carried for 23 years of solitary survival. Grace had seen him clean and oil the weapon each night, treating it with the reverence some men reserved for religious artifacts. Now she understood why. In Jonah's hands, the rifle became an extension of his will, precise and deadly. "How many do you count?" Grace called, her voice steadier than she felt. 3, maybe 4. Macready's got them spread out, trying to cover all the angles. Jonah risked a quick glance through the broken window. Professional work. These aren't just hired thugs. Then what are they? Killers. The word sent fresh ice through Grace's veins. She'd known Raymond Blackwell was dangerous, but she'd underestimated the lengths he'd go to reclaim his property. These men weren't planning to take her back alive. They were here to eliminate a problem. Can we hold them off? For a while. But they've got us pinned down, and ammunition doesn't last forever. Jonah's jaw was set in grim lines. We need to break their positions, make them come to us on our terms. Another volley of shots shattered what remained of the front window and punched fresh holes in the cabin walls. Grace flinched as a bullet whined past her head, so close she felt the displaced air against her cheek. "The root cellar," Jonah said suddenly. "There's a tunnel that leads from the cellar to the woodshed. Sarah and I dug it in case we ever needed an escape route. You want to run? I want to flank them. They expect us to stay holed up in here like trapped animals. Instead, we're going to become the hunters." Grace understood his strategy, but the thought of leaving the cabin's relative safety terrified her. Outside, Macready's men could be anywhere, waiting in ambush. What about the wounded one? He's out of the fight for now. Shoulder wound will slow him down, but it won't kill him. Jonah's expression was coldly practical. "We'll have to finish what we started." The clinical way he discussed killing sent a shiver through Grace, but she forced herself to focus on survival. These men had come to murder them both. Squeamishness was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Tell me what to do." Jonah's eyes met hers, and she saw approval there. "Follow me to the cellar. Stay low. Move fast. Once we're in the tunnel, I'll go left toward the woodshed. You circle right. Get behind that big pine where you can cover the cabin's rear. I'm not sure I can. You can. You've been practicing for weeks. Trust your training. Grace nodded, checking her rifle one more time. The weapon felt familiar now, no longer the alien thing it had been when Jonah first placed it in her hands. But using it against tin cans was different from shooting at human beings. Ready? Jonah asked. Before Grace could answer, the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was more ominous than the gunfire had been, suggesting that MacCready was planning something new. "Harris!" The tracker's voice carried clearly through the winter air. "I'm getting tired of this game. Send out the woman, and I'll make it quick for both of you. Keep fighting, and I'll take my time with her when I finally dig you out of there." Jonah's face went white with rage. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged." Grace found herself thinking about the past weeks, the way Jonah had patiently taught her to survive in this wilderness. He'd given her more than practical skills, he'd given her confidence, purpose, a sense of who she could become. The idea of MacCready's men dragging her back to Raymond Blackwell, of all that growth being stripped away, filled her with fury that burned hotter than fear. "Let's go," she said. They moved like shadows through the cabin, Grace following Jonah's lead as he navigated around furniture and debris. The root cellar entrance was concealed beneath a braided rug beside the fireplace. Jonah lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor, revealing a ladder that disappeared into darkness below. "Remember," he whispered as they descended, "accuracy over speed. Make every shot count." The cellar was small and cramped, filled with barrels of preserved food and sacks of grain. But at its far end, Grace could see the mouth of the tunnel Jonah had mentioned, a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single person. "Sarah's idea," Jonah explained quietly as they crawled toward the opening. "She said any home should have a back door, especially one this far from help." The tunnel was longer than Grace had expected, stretching perhaps 50 yards through frozen earth and tree roots. They emerged in the woodshed behind a carefully concealed entrance, brushing dirt and debris from their clothes. Outside, Grace could hear voices, MacCready's men coordinating their assault on the cabin. They sounded confident, certain that their quarry was trapped and helpless. "They're about to learn different," Jonah murmured. He checked his rifle one final time, then looked at Grace with an expression that was part warrior, part protector. "Whatever happens, don't let them take you alive. You understand?" Grace nodded, though the implications of his words made her stomach clench with dread. "Good. See you on the other side." He disappeared into the forest with the silent grace of a hunting cat, leaving Grace alone with her rifle and racing heart. She forced herself to move, circling toward the position he'd indicated, using every lesson he'd taught her about moving quietly through snow. The big pine tree stood perhaps 40 yards from the cabin's rear wall, its thick trunk providing excellent cover. Grace settled behind it, her rifle trained on the area where she'd heard voices. Her breath came in controlled puffs of vapor, and she fought to keep her hands steady despite the cold and adrenaline. From her position, she could see two of MacCready's men positioned behind fallen logs, their attention focused on the cabin's front entrance. They were waiting for their leader's signal to storm the building, confident that their prey was trapped inside. Grace thought of Jonah's lessons about patience, about waiting for the right moment. She steadied her breathing and sighted down the rifle's barrel, just as he'd taught her. The nearest man was perhaps 30 yards away, an easy shot if she could control her nerves. A rifle cracked from the direction of the woodshed. Jonah had made contact. One of MacCready's men cried out and toppled forward, clutching his leg. The wounded man tried to crawl toward better cover, but Grace could see he was badly hurt. "Charlie's hit!" someone shouted. "Boss, they got Charlie!" MacCready's voice roared with fury and surprise. "How the hell they're supposed to be in the cabin? Must have a back way out. Find it! Find them now!" The remaining attackers began moving, their careful positions abandoned as they tried to locate their hidden enemies. Grace watched through her rifle scope as one man broke from cover, running toward the cabin's rear wall. This was her moment. Everything Jonah had taught her crystallized into this single instant breath control, sight alignment, smooth trigger pull. Grace fired. The man stumbled and fell, his rifle spinning away into the snow. Grace felt a moment of sick triumph mixed with horror. She'd shot a human being. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, but she forced herself to reload, scanning for the next threat. "Grace," Jonah's voice carried through the forest. "Two down, two to go." McCready's remaining companion, a thin man with a scraggly beard, had taken cover behind Grace's original position near the cabin. He was firing wildly now, panic replacing professional calm as his easy capture became a deadly game of survival. "Jenkins, where are you?" McCready called. "Jenkins." No answer came. Grace realized with grim satisfaction that Jonah had eliminated another threat. That left only McCready himself and the bearded man she could see from her position. "Last chance, Harris." McCready's voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Call this off now, or—" Jonah's rifle spoke again, and the bearded man's head snapped back before he crumpled into the snow. The sudden silence that followed felt deafening. "Just you and me now, McCready," Jonah called from somewhere in the woods. "Your men are dead or dying. Time to settle this like men. Go to hell, Harris. The woman's mine, and I'm taking her back. Over my dead body. That's the idea." Grace heard movement through the trees, someone approaching her position. She swung her rifle toward the sound, finger on the trigger, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the scope, she caught glimpses of a dark coat moving between the pines. McCready had found her. The siege lasted 3 days. After the initial attack failed, and McCready's men lay dead in the snow, the tracker himself had vanished into the forest like smoke. Jonah found blood trails leading away from the clearing, but no body. McCready was wounded but still dangerous, somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding the cabin. "He'll be back," Jonah said as they dragged the bodies away from the cabin that first evening. "Men like McCready don't give up easy, and he's got nothing to lose now." Grace helped him search the dead men's belongings, looking for clues about who had hired them and how many more might be coming. What they found made her blood run cold. "Look at this." She held up a telegram from one of the attacker's pockets. "It's from Raymond Blackwell. He's offering $5,000 for my return, $10,000 if I'm delivered to a specific address in Denver." Jonah studied the telegram's contents, his expression growing darker. "This isn't about marriage anymore. These are bounty hunter prices." "What do you mean? 5,000 for capture, 10 for delivery to a specific location. That's elimination money." "Blackwell doesn't want you back. He wants you disappeared." The implication hit Grace like a physical blow. "But why? If I'm already missing, if everyone thinks I died in the stagecoach accident?" "Because you're not just anyone. You're Cornelius Whitmore's daughter. As long as you're alive, there's a chance you could surface later, inherit your father's railroad empire, cause problems for whatever deal Blackwell's cooking up." Grace sank into one of the cabin's hand-carved chairs, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy against her. "My father must be in on it. He has to know what kind of man Blackwell really is. Or Blackwell's got something on your father. Blackmail, debt, business leverage. Rich men have all kinds of ways to control each other." Over the next 2 days, they worked to fortify the cabin against McCready's return. Jonah showed Grace how to construct firing positions that offered protection while maintaining clear fields of view. They moved furniture to create internal barriers, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared escape routes through multiple exits. During the long winter evenings, with rifles always within reach, they found themselves talking about deeper things than survival tactics. The shared danger had stripped away the last of their careful politeness, leaving raw honesty in its place. "Tell me about your mother," Jonah said one night as they played chess by firelight. The hand-carved set was a masterpiece of patient craftsmanship, each piece unique and perfectly balanced. Grace had come to love these quiet moments between vigilance shifts, when they could pretend the world beyond the cabin walls didn't exist. She was beautiful, Grace said, moving her knight to threaten his bishop. Not just physically, though she was that too. Beautiful in her kindness, her ability to see good in everyone. She died when I was 12, and father, he never recovered. He threw himself into business, building the railroad empire as a monument to her memory. Is that why you became so important to his plans? The railroad princess who'd marry well and expand the family legacy? Grace nodded, studying the chessboard without really seeing it. I was his last connection to her. Everything he did after she died was supposedly for me, for my future, but really, it was for her ghost. Jonah captured her knight with a smooth movement of his queen. And you went along with it, until now, until I realized that living someone else's dream isn't really living at all. She looked up from the board to meet his eyes. What about you? Did you always want to be a mountain man? I was a blacksmith before I came up here. Had a shop in Denver, decent business, plans to expand. Jonah's fingers found the chain around his neck, unconsciously, the one that held Sarah's wedding ring. Met Sarah at a church social. She was visiting from back east, staying with relatives. Most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But more than that, she was alive in a way that made everyone around her seem half asleep. Love at first sight. Something like that. We were married 6 months later, moved up here because she wanted to help the settlers and miners who had no access to medical care. I built this cabin with my own hands, every board and beam chosen specifically for her. Grace moved her bishop, though her attention was entirely on Jonah's words. You must have been so happy. Happiest man alive. Every morning I'd wake up thinking I was the luckiest soul on earth. His voice caught slightly. Then she got pregnant, and we thought things couldn't get any better. What happened? During the birth, I mean. Jonah was quiet for so long, Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Breech presentation. Baby was turned wrong. Couldn't come out naturally. Sarah struggled for 18 hours while I held her hand and watched her weaken. By the time I realized we needed help, the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away in weather too bad to travel. You couldn't have known. I should have taken her to town before her time came. Should have insisted on staying near medical help. Instead, I let her convince me that mountain women had been having babies for generations without fancy doctors. Grace reached across the chessboard and covered his hand with hers. She was a healer herself. She would have known the risks better than anyone. And she chose to take them because she wanted our child so badly. Jonah's thumb traced Sarah's ring through his shirt. Lost them both. Sarah bled to death while I held our son beautiful, perfect, but he never took a breath. Tears ran down Grace's cheeks as she imagined his agony. 23 years of grief and guilt, 23 years of punishing himself for circumstances beyond his control. I'm so sorry. After that, I couldn't face going back to the world. Couldn't pretend to care about horseshoes and wagon wheels when the only things that mattered were buried on the hill behind this cabin. So you stayed. I stayed. Figured I'd live out my days up here, maybe join them when winter finally claimed me. Never planned on. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. On what? On caring about someone again. On having something worth protecting. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Grace felt her heart racing, aware that they were approaching territory more dangerous than Macready's bullets. Jonah. A sound from outside cut her off, the soft scrape of snow being disturbed by careful footsteps. Both of them froze, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. He's back, Jonah whispered. Grace blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness lit only by the fire's dying glow. Through the repaired window, she could see moonlight on snow, shadows that might be trees or might be men. How long do you think he'll wait this time? She breathed. Not long. He's wounded, probably running out of supplies. This is his last chance. As if summoned by Jonah's words, Macready's voice carried through the night air, closer than before. I know you're listening, Harris. I've got a proposition for you. Grace discovered the letter by accident, While cleaning Sarah's medical journal the morning after Macready's latest threat, the binding split slightly, revealing a hidden compartment she'd never noticed. Inside, folded into a careful square and yellowed with age, was a single sheet of paper covered in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Jonah, if you are reading this, then God has called me home, as I feared he might. I have hidden this letter where only someone who truly cares for my things would find it, hoping that someday, perhaps years from now, it will find its way to you when you need it most." Grace's hands trembled as she continued reading, aware that she was intruding on something intensely private, but unable to stop. "I know you will blame yourself for whatever happens to me and our child. You will think you failed us, that you should have done something different, been something more. My darling husband, this is the burden I fear most about leaving you, not death itself, but the weight of unearned guilt you will carry. Please know that I came to this mountain knowing the risks. I chose to have our baby here not out of recklessness, but because I wanted our child born in the home you built with such love. I wanted to give birth surrounded by the life we created together, not in some sterile town where you would pace the floors alone while strangers tended me. If the worst happens, you must not let it destroy you. I have loved you with every breath I've taken since the day we met, and that love demands something of you now. It demands that you live, really live, not just survive. You were made for love, Jonah, made to build and create and protect. Don't waste those gifts in isolation. Our child may not survive to need your guidance, but somewhere there will be other children, other souls who need what you have to offer. Our love may end with my death, but your capacity for love must not. I want you to remarry. I want you to find happiness again. If another woman can love you even half as much as I do, she will be blessed beyond measure, and you will be the man I always knew you could be. Promise me, my love. Promise me you will not let grief become your master. Promise me you will be brave enough to love again. Until we meet in glory, your devoted wife, Sarah." Grace sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. For 23 years, Jonah had been carrying guilt that his dying wife had specifically begged him to release. For 23 years, he'd been honoring her memory by doing the exact opposite of what she'd wanted for him. "Grace," Jonah's voice came from the doorway. "What's wrong?" She looked up to find him standing there with an armload of firewood, his expression shifting from concern to shock as he saw what she held in her hands. "Where did you get that?" "It was hidden in the journal binding. I think she meant for you to find it someday." Grace held out the letter with shaking hands. "You need to read this." Jonah set down the wood and approached slowly, as if the paper might bite him. "I can't. If it's from Sarah, if it's something she wrote, please, it's important." With obvious reluctance, Jonah took the letter and began to read. Grace watched his face cycle through disbelief, pain, and something that might have been hope, before settling into an expression of profound sadness. "She wanted me to remarry," he said finally, his voice hollow. "She wanted me to find someone else. She wanted you to be happy. How could she think I could ever love anyone else? How could she ask that of me?" Grace stood and moved closer, close enough to see the unshed tears in his eyes. "Because she loved you more than her own memory. Because she knew that 23 years of grief wasn't what love looks like, it's what fear looks like. You don't understand. Sarah was everything to me. Everything good and pure and worthy in my life. How do I honor that by forgetting her? You don't forget her. You honor her by doing what she asked, by living." Jonah crumpled the letter against his chest, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "I tried to die, you know. That first winter after she was gone. Stopped eating, stopped maintaining the fire. Figured I'd just let the cold take me. Let us be together again. What stopped you? A wolf pack attacked the cabin. 3 of them, driven by hunger to take risks they'd never normally take. I had to fight to save my life, and afterward I realized that Sarah would have been ashamed of me for giving up so easily. Grace thought of Sarah's letter, of a dying woman's desperate plea for her husband to embrace life instead of surrendering to death. "So you survived, but you never really lived." "I couldn't. Every time I tried to move forward, I felt like I was betraying her memory. And now—" Jonah looked at Grace with an expression that was part wonder, part terror. "Now I don't know what to think. For weeks, I've been feeling things I swore I'd never feel again. Caring about someone other than myself, wanting to protect them, to—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "To what?" Grace prompted gently. "To love them." The admission hung between them like a bridge, finally ready to be crossed. Grace felt her heart racing as she realized that everything had changed. The letter hadn't just revealed Sarah's final wishes, it had given Jonah permission to feel what had been growing between them since the day he'd carried her unconscious form into his cabin. "The first woman you've touched in 23 years, she said softly, remembering his whispered words from that first night. "The first woman I've wanted to touch." Grace moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What does Sarah's letter tell you about wanting that? That she'd forgive me for it, that maybe she'd even approve. And what does your heart tell you?" Jonah's hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "That I'm falling in love with you, Grace Whitmore. That despite everything I swore about never caring for anyone again, you've found your way into my heart." "And is that so terrible?" "Terrifying, but not terrible." Grace leaned into his touch, 23 years of his isolation melting away in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I love you too, Jonah. I think I have since that first morning when you taught me to shoot. When I saw the man you really are, beneath all that grief." They moved toward each other like planets drawn by gravity, inevitable and natural. When their lips met, Grace tasted salt tears, his or hers, she couldn't tell. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper, as months of careful distance collapsed into urgent need. "Grace," Jonah whispered against her mouth, "are you sure, once we cross this line?" His words were cut off by the sound of shattering glass, as a rifle bullet crashed through the window they'd repaired just days before. MacCready had chosen his moment perfectly, striking just as their defenses were lowered by overwhelming emotion. "Get down!" Jonah shouted, pushing Grace behind the overturned table as more shots peppered the cabin walls. But this time, something was different. Grace could hear multiple voices outside, more men than MacCready could have summoned alone. Through the broken window, she glimpsed movement in the trees, not one tracker, but a small army. "Jonah," she breathed, horror dawning. "I think Blackwell sent reinforcements." The pocket watch had stopped at 3:47. Jonah held his father's timepiece in his weathered hands, its silver case catching the firelight as Grace bandaged a graze on his shoulder from the latest attack. The watch had been a wedding gift from Sarah, presented on their first anniversary, with a promise that their time together would be measured not in hours, but in decades of shared happiness. It had stopped the moment Sarah died, as if time itself had refused to continue without her. For 23 years, Jonah had carried the silent watch like a talisman of his grief, unwilling to wind it and let it mark the passage of days that meant nothing without her. Now, as MacCready's reinforcements surrounded the cabin and Grace's gentle hands tended his wounds, Jonah felt something shift deep in his chest. Sarah's letter lay open on the table between them, her words echoing in his memory. "Promise me you will be brave enough to love again. We can't hold them off much longer," Grace said quietly, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency. Her weeks of mountain living had transformed her from a pampered heiress into someone who could tend wounds without flinching, who could reload a rifle under fire without missing a beat. "I know." Jonah studied her face in the lamplight, memorizing every detail, the determined set of her jaw, the way her dark hair escaped its pins to frame her cheeks, the green eyes that had learned to look at danger without blinking. "Grace, if they take you, they won't. If they do," he continued firmly, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the best of my life since Sarah died. You brought me back to the world, made me remember what it means to hope for tomorrow." Grace's hands stilled on his shoulder. "Don't talk like this is over. Look around us. 8 men with rifles, probably more coming. We're low on ammunition, trapped in a cabin that's more hole than wall at this point." Jonah's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I've been in enough fights to know how this one ends." "Then what do you suggest? Surrender?" "I suggest we make them pay such a price for victory that they'll remember this cabin for the rest of their lives." Jonah stood and moved to the window, studying the positions of their enemies through the shattered glass. "How many bullets do you have left?" Grace checked her ammunition. 12 rounds. I've got perhaps 20. Against 8 men, that's not many chances to miss." Outside, McCready's voice carried through the winter air with renewed confidence. "Harris, I know you're running low on shots. My employer sent enough men to level this mountain if necessary. Give us the woman, and you can walk away from this." "What employer?" Jonah called back, though he already suspected the answer. "Raymond Blackwell sends his regards. Says to tell Miss Whitmore that he's very disappointed in her lack of gratitude for his generous marriage proposal." Grace felt ice run through her veins. Blackwell hadn't just sent trackers, he'd sent an execution squad. The man who'd wanted to marry her now wanted her dead, and he had the resources to make it happen. "He's lying about letting you walk away," she said to Jonah. "Blackwell can't afford to leave witnesses." "I know." Jonah checked his rifle one more time, then moved to the cabin's rear window. "But he made a mistake bringing this many men. They'll get in each other's way, create opportunities we can exploit." "What kind of opportunities?" Jonah was quiet for a moment, his tactical mind working through possibilities. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced death before and made peace with it. "The tunnel to the woodshed. If I can get outside, circle around behind them, I might be able to even the odds. That's suicide. They'll cut you down before you get 20 yards. "Maybe, but it's better than waiting here for them to burn us out or starve us into submission." Jonah turned from the window to face her. "Grace, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens tonight, whatever choices I make, they're not about dying for honor or glory. They're about living long enough to protect what matters most. And what's that? You, us. The chance for something beautiful to grow in this God-forsaken wilderness." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as the full weight of his words settled over her. "Jonah, please. There has to be another way." "There is. You could surrender. Tell them you'll go quietly if they let me live." "Never. Then we fight, together, for as long as we can." Jonah reached into his pocket and withdrew the pocket watch, its silver surface worn smooth by decades of handling. With deliberate movements, he began to wind the mechanism, feeling the mainspring tighten under his fingers. "What are you doing?" "Starting time again." The watch face flickered to life, its hands beginning their eternal circuit. "Sarah wanted me to live, not just survive. Tonight, I choose to live, really live, for however long we have left." Grace watched the second hand sweep around the watch face, marking moments that suddenly felt precious beyond measure. "How long do you think? Until dawn, maybe. They'll want to finish this before daylight, when their numbers won't be as much of an advantage. That's hours away. Then we make every minute count." Jonah set the watch on the table and turned to Grace with an expression that was part warrior, part lover. The combination took her breath away. "Tell me about California," he said, "about the life you were planning to build there." "What? If we're going to die tonight, I want to know what dreams we're dying for." Grace understood. He was asking for hope, for something beautiful to hold on to in their darkest hour. She thought of the plans she'd made during her desperate flight west, the freedom she'd imagined awaiting her on the Pacific shore. "I wanted to teach children," she said. "Open a school for miners' daughters and ranch wives' sons, give them the education their isolation denies them." "That's a good dream. What about you? If we could walk out of here tomorrow, what would you want?" Jonah considered the question seriously. I'd want to build something, not just survive anymore, but create. Maybe houses for the families moving west, maybe a trading post to help travelers, something that makes the world a little better. We could do that together. Yes, he said simply. We could. Outside, the sound of men moving through snow grew closer. Macready was positioning his forces for a final assault, probably planning to rush the cabin from multiple directions simultaneously. Grace, Jonah said urgently, whatever happens, I want you to know. She silenced him with a kiss, fierce and desperate, and full of all the words they didn't have time to say. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I know, she whispered. I know. Jonah nodded and moved toward the trapdoor that led to the root cellar. Give me 10 minutes to get in position. When the shooting starts, you concentrate on the front approach. I'll handle the flankers. Jonah, he paused at her voice, come back to me. I'll do my best. As the trapdoor closed behind him, Grace was left alone with the ticking of the pocket watch and the weight of a loaded rifle. Outside, she could hear Macready giving final orders to his men, the quiet professionalism of killers preparing for their work. She thought of Sarah's letter, of a dying woman's plea for her husband to embrace life instead of surrendering to death. Tonight, Grace would honor that request by fighting for the future Sarah had wanted Jonah to have. The first shots shattered the silence, and Grace Whitmore, former railroad heiress, current mountain woman, began to fight for love. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Grace pressed herself against the cabin's front wall, rifle ready, as Macready's men emerged from the tree line like hunting wolves. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, and bullets shattered what remained of the windows, sending splinters of wood and glass flying through the air. But something was wrong with their assault. The men moved with professional precision, but their positioning was too careful, too controlled. They were trying to capture, not kill, at least not immediately. Alive, boys, Macready's voice carried over the gunfire. Mr. Blackwell wants her breathing when we deliver her to Denver. The realization sent fresh terror through Grace's veins. Being taken alive meant torture, meant whatever slow death Raymond Blackwell had planned for the woman who dared defy him. She thought of Sarah's letter, of Jonah's promise to protect what mattered most, and steeled herself for what was coming. Her first shot took down the lead attacker, a bearded man who'd gotten too confident in his approach to the cabin's front door. He dropped like a stone, his rifle spinning away into the snow. Grace reloaded quickly, just as Jonah had taught her, and fired again. From somewhere in the darkness behind the cabin, she heard Jonah's rifle speak once, twice, 3 times, in rapid succession. Each shot was followed by screams of pain or rage, proof that his flanking maneuver was working. "Jenkins is down!" someone shouted. "Boss, Harris got Jenkins and Murphy both." "Then finish him," Macready roared. "I don't care what it takes." Grace heard boots on the cabin's roof. Someone had climbed up while she was focused on the front assault. She swung her rifle toward the ceiling just as a section of wooden planking exploded inward. A man dropped through the opening, landing hard, but rolling to his feet with practiced ease. He was young, maybe 25, with cold eyes and scarred hands that spoke of violence as profession rather than passion. Grace fired without thinking, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around. But he kept moving, drawing a pistol despite his wound. "Drop the rifle, sweetheart," he said, blood running down his arm. "Make this easy on both of us." Grace's answer was another shot that missed by inches, splintering the wall behind his head. The young killer dove for cover behind Sarah's old rocking chair, and Grace found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse inside the cabin that had become her home. Outside, Jonah's battle was reaching its crescendo. Grace could hear him moving through the forest like a ghost, his rifle picking off Macready's men with methodical precision. But there were too many of them, and even Jonah's wilderness skills had limits. Sarah's guardian spoke again from the woods, and another voice cried out in pain. That made 4 down, by Grace's count. 4 dead or wounded out of 8. If she could handle the man in the cabin, if Jonah could continue his guerrilla tactics. A bullet whined past her ear, snapping her attention back to her immediate threat. The wounded killer had found an angle of attack, using the rocking chair as mobile cover while he maneuvered for a clear shot. "You're just making this harder on yourself," he called, his voice tight with pain. "Blackwell's going to have you either way. Question is whether you're walking or crawling when he gets his hands on you." "Neither," Grace replied, steadying her rifle against the doorframe. "I'm not going anywhere with Raymond Blackwell." "That's what you think." The killer broke from cover in a desperate rush, counting on speed and surprise to overcome Grace's rifle advantage. But weeks of training under Jonah's patient instruction had prepared her for exactly this moment. She didn't panic, didn't hurry her shot. Instead, she breathed steadily, acquired her target, and squeezed the trigger with smooth precision. The bullet caught the killer center mass, stopping his charge immediately. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. "Impossible," he whispered, then collapsed. Grace stood over his body, rifle still ready, waiting to see if he would move again. When he didn't, she felt a moment of grim satisfaction mixed with revulsion. She'd killed a man, not wounded him like the others, but ended his life completely. The knowledge sat heavy in her stomach, but she forced herself to focus on survival rather than sentiment. Through the broken windows, she could see muzzle flashes in the forest as Jonah continued his deadly game of hide-and-seek with MacCready's remaining men. But the gunfire was getting closer to the cabin, which meant the hunters were becoming the hunted. "Grace!" Jonah's voice carried through the darkness, urgent with warning. "More coming from the east, at least 3. She moved to the cabin's side window, seeing shapes moving between the trees. Reinforcements, just as she'd feared. MacCready had planned for heavy resistance, bringing enough men to overwhelm even the most determined defense. "How many bullets?" she called back. 5. "You?" Grace checked her ammunition with growing despair. 4. 9 bullets against at least 3 fresh attackers, plus MacCready himself. The mathematics of survival were turning against them, and they both knew it. But then Grace remembered something, the railroad map her father had given her before she fled Boston, detailing his holdings across the Western Territories. She was Grace Whitmore, daughter of one of the most powerful men in America. That had to count for something, even here in the wilderness. "MacCready," she shouted into the night, "I want to make a deal." The gunfire paused as her words echoed through the forest. "What kind of deal?" the tracker called back, suspicion evident in his voice. "The kind that makes you richer than Raymond Blackwell ever could." The silence stretched like a held breath. MacCready was thinking, weighing greed against professional obligation. Grace could almost hear the calculations running through his mind, Blackwell's bounty against whatever she might offer, the certainty of payment against the risk of betraying a dangerous employer. "Keep talking," he called finally. Grace moved closer to the broken window, making sure her voice would carry clearly. "My father is Cornelius Whitmore. He owns half the railroad lines west of the Mississippi, plus mining interests, timber rights, and shipping contracts worth millions. Bring me back to him alive, and he'll pay you more than Blackwell ever could." "How much more?" $25,000, cash, more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of bounty hunting. She heard murmured conversation from the woods, MacCready consulting with his remaining men. The pause gave Jonah time to reposition himself, and Grace caught a glimpse of his shadow moving between the pine trees. "And why would your daddy pay to get back a daughter who ran away from home?" MacCready's voice was closer now, perhaps 30 yards from the cabin. "Because I'm his only heir. Because the railroad empire dies with me if I'm not there to inherit it." Grace injected desperation into her voice, the kind of fear a cornered heiress might genuinely feel. "Blackwell wants me dead so he can take over my father's holdings. But if I'm alive, if I testify about his murder attempts, you're saying Blackwell's been lying to us?" "I'm saying he's been using you, The marriage contract he showed my father. It includes provisions that transfer railroad ownership to Blackwell if I die before producing an heir. He doesn't want a wife, he wants a business acquisition. The accusation hit its mark. Grace could hear angry voices from the forest, Macready's men realizing they'd been manipulated into a conspiracy that went far beyond simple bounty hunting. "Even if that's true," Macready called, "how do I know your father will pay? How do I know this isn't just another lie to save your skin?" Grace reached into her dress and withdrew the railroad map, unfolding it so the moonlight caught its detailed markings. "Because I can prove who I am. I have documents, maps, information about railroad holdings that only Cornelius Whitmore's daughter would possess." She held the map up to the window where Macready could see it, gambling that his greed would overcome his caution. "Boss," one of his men said loudly enough for Grace to hear, "if she's telling the truth about Blackwell." "I know what it means," Macready snapped. "It means we've been played for fools." From the darkness beyond the cabin, Jonah's voice cut through the night with deadly calm. "It means you're all dead men." The words carried such quiet certainty that Grace felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't Jonah, the grieving hermit, speaking. This was someone else entirely, someone forged by loss and tempered by 23 years of mountain survival. "Harris," Macready called, "this doesn't concern you. Walk away now, and we'll pretend this never happened." "Can't do that. You came to my mountain, threatened the woman I love. That makes it very much my concern." Jonah stepped into view at the edge of the clearing, Sarah's wedding ring glinting in his left hand. With deliberate movements, he removed the chain from around his neck and set the ring gently on a snow-covered stump. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the still air, "I'm ready to let you rest now. Ready to live again." Grace watched through the window as he straightened, and for the first time since she'd known him, Jonah Harris looked like a man unburdened by the weight of the past. The change was so dramatic it took her breath away. "Last chance," Macready warned. "There are 4 of us left, and you're just one man. One man with nothing left to lose and everything worth protecting." Jonah raised Sarah's guardian, the rifle that had been his companion through decades of solitude. "Care to test those odds?" The first shot came from Macready's position, a hasty attempt to end the standoff before it could develop. But Jonah was no longer where the bullet aimed. He'd moved with fluid grace, disappearing into shadows that seemed to welcome him home. His response was immediate and devastating. Sarah's guardian spoke once, and one of Macready's men cried out, clutching his leg as he toppled from behind a fallen log. "3 now," Jonah called conversationally. "Anyone else want to reconsider their life choices?" Grace used the distraction to move to a better position, one that gave her a clear view of the remaining attackers. She could see Macready now, crouched behind a boulder with 2 other men. All 3 looked nervous, their earlier confidence shaken by Jonah's display of lethal skill. "You can't get all of us," Macready shouted. "Don't need to get all of you," Jonah replied. "Just need to get you." The psychological warfare was working. Grace could see the remaining men glancing at each other, questioning their leader's judgment. The promise of easy money was evaporating in the face of a mountain man who fought like a force of nature. Macready seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. "Take him down," he ordered, "all together." But his men hesitated, unwilling to break cover against an enemy who'd already proven his deadly accuracy. In that moment of hesitation, Jonah struck again. The rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and 2 more voices cried out in pain. When the echoes faded, only Macready remained upright among his force. "Just you and me now," Jonah said, stepping back into the moonlight, "the way it should have been from the beginning." Macready rose from behind his boulder, rifle in hand, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You think you've won? Blackwell will send more men. He'll never stop hunting her. Then I'll kill them too." The simple statement carried such absolute conviction that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. Here was a man who'd found something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. The isolation that had protected him from further loss had become a strength he could use to protect what he loved. "You're a fool, Harris. She's not worth dying for. She's worth everything." Macready raised his rifle, but Jonah was already moving. Sarah's guardian roared one final time, and the tracker spun around before crashing face first into the snow. Silence settled over the clearing like a blanket, broken only by the soft tick of the pocket watch inside the cabin. Grace stood frozen at the window, hardly daring to believe that it was over. "Grace," Jonah's voice was gentle now, the warrior persona fading back into the man she'd fallen in love with. "Are you hurt?" She ran outside without bothering to grab her coat, throwing herself into his arms with such force that they both nearly tumbled into the snow. He held her tight against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." Spring came early that year, arriving with a warmth that seemed to melt more than just the winter snow. Grace stood in the meadow behind the cabin, wearing a simple white dress she'd sewn from fabric Jonah had traded for in the valley below. Wild columbines dotted the grass around her feet, the same flowers Sarah had pressed in her medical journal all those years ago. But today they weren't memories of the past, they were promises of the future. "You ready for this?" Jonah asked, straightening his black string tie with fingers that trembled slightly. He'd trimmed his hair and beard for the occasion, and Grace thought she'd never seen a more handsome man. "I've been ready since the morning you taught me to shoot," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Since the moment I realized that being safe isn't the same as being alive." The preacher they'd found in Silver Creek was a weathered man who'd seen enough frontier weddings to appreciate their unique circumstances. He stood beneath a pine tree that Jonah had decorated with ribbons, his Bible open to familiar passages about love and commitment. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying across the meadow, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these mountains to join this man and woman in holy matrimony." Grace thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the stagecoach accident that had seemed like the end of the world. The desperate flight from Raymond Blackwell's ambitions, the gradual awakening of love in a cabin built by grief and transformed by hope. Blackwell himself was dead now, killed in a Denver saloon by one of his own associates who'd grown tired of the shipping magnate's increasingly erratic behavior. The news had reached them through a traveling merchant, along with word that Cornelius Whitmore was publicly offering a substantial reward for information about his missing daughter's whereabouts. "Do you, Jonah Harris, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jonah said, his voice strong and sure. "With all my heart." The words carried the weight of a man who'd thought he'd never love again, who'd spent 23 years in isolation before learning that the human heart was more resilient than he'd ever imagined. "Do you, Grace Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Grace replied, thinking of the woman she'd been when winter began, frightened, sheltered, running from one trap into another. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who could shoot straight, tend wounds, and fight for what mattered most. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jonah's kiss was gentle but passionate, full of all the promises they'd made to each other during the long winter nights. When they broke apart, Grace saw tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of joy so profound it couldn't be contained. "Mrs. Harris," he whispered against her forehead. "Mr. Harris," she replied, laughing at how perfectly the name fit. The celebration was small but heartfelt. A few neighboring families had made the journey to witness the ceremony, bringing food and music and the kind of genuine warmth that city society had never offered Grace. As the sun set behind the mountains, they gathered around a bonfire Jonah had built, sharing stories and songs that echoed across the valley. Later, much later, Grace and Jonah sat alone on the cabin's front porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The new wedding rings Jonah had crafted gleamed on their fingers, simple bands of silver that caught the moonlight. "Any regrets?" Jonah asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Grace considered the question seriously. She thought of the railroad empire she'd walked away from, the comfortable life she'd abandoned, the security she'd traded for uncertainty in the wilderness. "None," she said finally. "Not a single one." Even about the money, the inheritance? Grace smiled, thinking of the letter she'd written to her father, not asking for forgiveness or financial support, but simply letting him know that his daughter was alive, happy, and building a life worth living. "Money can't buy what we have," she said. "Besides, we're rich in the ways that matter." Jonah's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy intimacy of two people who'd learned to trust completely. "Sarah would have liked you," he said quietly. "She would have been happy that I found love again." "I hope so. I'd like to think she approves of what we're building here." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their mountain home. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and Grace smiled at the appropriateness of the sound creatures calling to each other across the darkness, finding connection in a vast and sometimes hostile world. "What do you want to do tomorrow?" Jonah asked. "Tomorrow, I want to start the school." Grace had already begun teaching the children of nearby families, using Sarah's medical journal and other books to provide education that would have been impossible for isolated mountain families to obtain otherwise. The work filled her with purpose in a way that charity luncheons and social obligations never had. "And after that?" "After that, I want to help you build that trading post you mentioned. Create something that helps other travelers, other families trying to make new lives in the wilderness. Big dreams for a railroad heiress." "Former railroad heiress," Grace corrected. "Current mountain woman, and proud of it." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, Grace felt a familiar flutter in her abdomen, the subtle movement that had begun just days ago, the sign that their love had already begun creating new life. She hadn't told Jonah yet, hadn't found the right moment to share the news that would complete their transformation from two isolated souls into a real family. But soon, she thought. Soon. "I love you, Grace Harris," Jonah said, the name still new enough to bring wonder to his voice. "I love you too," she replied, placing her hand over the secret growing within her. "More than I ever thought possible." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, marking time for lovers and dreamers across the world. In a cabin built by grief and transformed by hope, two people who'd found each other against all odds settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys in equal measure. Sometimes, life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it feels like the end of the world. Grace Whitmore had learned that truth in the hardest way possible, but as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she couldn't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. The first woman Jonah Harris had touched in 23 years had become the last woman he'd ever need to love. And in the morning, when spring sunshine filled their mountain valley with golden light, they would begin building the future that love had made possible.